Guten Abend und ganz herzlich willkommen zu dieser ersten Lesung im Literaturhaus im neuen Jahr. Und es ist besonders schön, dass wir 2025 mit Tash Aw beginnen können. Dear Tash Aw, what a pleasure to have you as a first author reading here in this new year. So welcome to Zurich. Thank you for coming.
I'm very honored.
Michael Krogerus wird den Abend heute moderieren. Er ist bekannt als Autor von Sachbüchern und als Journalist in Zürich, vielleicht ganz besonders, unter anderem durch seine Kolumnen und Beiträge im Magazin des Tagesanzeigers. Herzlich willkommen, Michael Krogerus.
Danke.
Und Chantal Dubs wird aus der deutschen Übersetzung heute Abend lesen. Sie ist freie Schauspielerin, sie ist in Film, Fernsehen und Theater zu sehen und eben ab und zu auch auf der Bühne des Literaturhauses. Ganz herzlich willkommen, Chantal Dubs. Und das Buch, um das es heute geht, ist Fremde am Pier, Untertitel Porträt einer Familie. Es ist letztes Jahr im Luchterhand Verlag erschienen, wurde übersetzt aus dem Englischen von Pociao und Roberto de Hollanda. Strangers on a Pier is a slim book at first sight, and at the same time I had the feeling of entering a whole universe when I was reading it. It's an impressive example of what it means to come to terms with your family history, and above all also how much yourself are shaped by it. And I felt it's like a constant motion and emotion between leaving and arriving, between closeness and distance, between knowledge and life, between silence and remembrance, and also between love and separation. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about this book and also listen to the book. And ich wünsche uns viel Vergnügen und wie schön, dass Sie alle heute hier sind.
Thank you so much and welcome to Zurich. Tash Aw, good to have you here. Before we start talking about your lovely memoir, I would like the audience to get a chance to get to know you a little bit. And I would like to do that by playing a little game with you. He doesn't know what's going to happen now. It's a game I learned from my mother. And my mother is a psychotherapist.
Very dangerous.
Indeed. And she once explained to me that the typical opening question with a new patient would be, what brought you here, or how can I help you? But sometimes that question is already too much. It's just overwhelming for the patient. So therefore, she once learned from a professor that a better way to start a conversation with a new patient is to have the patient talk about something he or she cares deeply about. Because if we talk about things we care about, we are actually talking about ourselves. And my mother suggested to me that she often does this with patients, that she has them talk about people or places or books they love deeply. So this is what we're going to do now. I would like to, let's call this book, place, person.
Okay.
And let's start with a book. It doesn't have to be your favorite book, but maybe a book that has been formative for you in your life. What is your book, Tash?
Giovanni's Room, James Baldwin.
And why is that?
Oh, I have to say why as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
Okay. Sorry. This is a bit overwhelming. I think it's to do with so much that is important to me as a person and as a writer, which is being a foreigner in a city that is at once magical but also slightly hostile, and to try and find your way amidst the kind of the noise and the sights and the bewilderment, the thrill of that new city, but also the dislocation that you feel and how you find that sense of connection with that city. And it's often by finding people. And within this network of people, how you deal with desire. So how do you deal with desire when you are trying to find yourself in a new city, which is both foreign and therefore dangerous, but also kind of fascinating.
Do you remember when you read that for the first time?
Yeah, I must have been first year in university, so 19 or 20.
And who gifted you that book?
I bought it. I mean, it was a famous. I bought it from a second-hand bookshop.
Did you know what you were buying, or was that?
I knew what I was buying. I
Okay,
knew what I knew what I was buying. I searched for that book.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I was not an innocent.
So, what is your place?
The place that is it's the
That's
place that
dear
is,
to you,
that
that
is-
you maybe that you go to if you feel lost.
That's more difficult. The place that I go to if I'm feeling lost is Kuala Lumpur. I mean, that's where I'm from. It's where I grew up mostly. It's which is not the same as it being the city that I love the most. It's really not a city that I love, but it's a city that I know, and I think it's very important when thinking about cities and places to live, that we don't just think in terms of loving or hating. People always tend to, now I'm for this year I'm on a fellowship in Berlin, but mainly I live in Paris. And Paris is a city that people always say, oh, I love Paris. And it's a little bit like saying, I love my mother, which we'll get on to talking. I love my mother, or I love my father. I love my husband, my wife, my spouse, my boyfriend. Love in those cases, like love for one's hometown, is often considered to be blanket. It's a universal thing, and it's 100%. I love that person without condition. But in fact, love isn't that. What makes love is the fact that it's tinged with resentment. It's tinged with a sense of discomfort. It's tinged with a sense of, I don't really like this place very much, but I still somehow love it. So that would be the easy answer to that question.
Thank you. I would love to hear the answer from what my mother would think about that, but let's leave her aside.
I don't think I need to meet your mother.
And finally, who is your person?
Who's my person that I turn to for I mean, I have to think about this, but it depends what for. If it's it depends. I mean, for most things, I guess it would be my husband, but it depends what it is. If it's a writing thing, then it'll be one of my close friends, writing friends.
Let's rephrase it. What is a person that is on your mind a lot lately?
The person that's on my mind a lot lately is Trump. But this is not, this is not.
Yeah.
I don't think he's an important. He's on my mind a lot, but he's not an important person personally to me.
Yeah.
But yeah. So
Okay. Good.
this is. I think I find this line of questioning interesting because it is. It's kind of the opposite of kind of line of questioning that I start off pursuing in Strangers on the Pier. But I start off pursuing in exactly this fashion. I start off talking to my parents about what it means to be an immigrant. I want them to tell me about their childhood. I want them to tell me what is the most important memory. What is the first memory you had? And actually, what I found was they couldn't give me any of that. Mm-hmm. And so the real answers lie not in one single word or one single place or one single memory. The real answers to someone's life, I think, comes from the fact that the story is messy. And that's why the book is what it is, mm-hmm. which is messy.
But do you like being asked these questions? Or do you react a little bit like your parents did?
No, I don't mind. I mean, I think I've trained myself over many years to be the opposite of my parents. Whether or not we can we can be entirely successful in being the opposite of our parents is another thing. I think this is, it's something that we all think we can be the opposite of our parents, but in fact, where we rarely succeed. Not in being completely different, anyway.
All right, thank you so much. This was just the introduction. And let's now turn to your book. And we're going to have read the first, the opening chapter by Chantal.
Ich sitze im Taxi in Bangkok. Mein Begleiter, Europäer, weiß, spricht fließend Thai. Doch jedes Mal, wenn er etwas sagt, dreht sich der Taxifahrer mit seiner Antwort zu mir um. Ich schüttle den Kopf. Pom mai ben Thai. Ich bin kein Thai. Not Thai. Er sieht weiterhin mich an, wenn er spricht, nicht meinen Freund. Ich bin das passive Bindeglied dieser seltsamen Dreierunterhaltung. Ich bin in Nepal, in den Hügeln westlich von Pokhara. Ein Dorfschullehrer behauptet steif und fest, ich gehörte zu den Gurung, einer ethnischen Gruppe von Schafhirten und Soldaten. Ich stamme aus Malaysia, entgegne ich. Bist du sicher? Vielleicht war dein Vater ein Gurkha-Soldat, der gegen die malaysischen Kommunisten kämpfte. Später mustere ich mein Gesicht im Spiegel. Meine Wangen sind rosig und sonnenverbrannt von den langen Trekkingtagen in großer Höhe, die Augen zusammengekniffen wegen des grellen Lichts. Meiner Ansicht nach sehe ich aus wie ein Ausländer, genauer gesagt wie jemand von hier. Vielleicht bin ich ein Gurung. Ich gehe an Bord eines Cathay Pacific Flugs von Shanghai nach Hongkong. Die Airline-Mitarbeiter am Boarding Gate, Festlandchinesen, verabschieden sich von mir auf Mandarin, doch 20 Meter weiter an der Tür der Maschine begrüßen mich die Mitglieder der Crew, Hongkong-Chinesen, auf Kantonesisch. Mir fällt auf, dass die meisten anderen Passagiere mit chinesischen Wurzeln diese spezielle Behandlung nicht erhalten. Es hat mit meinem Gesicht zu tun. Meine Gesichtszüge sind neutral, unauffällig, die Hautfarbe veränderlich, blass in den sonnenarmen Klimazonen des Nordens, doch nach 1 oder 2 Tagen in den Tropen wird sie schnell dunkler. Mein Gesicht fügt sich in die kulturelle Landschaft Asiens ein. Östlich von Indien wird meine Identität elastisch und passt sich den Menschen um mich herum an. Manchmal frage ich mich, ob ich diesem Prozess unbewusst Vorschub leiste, indem ich meine Bewegungen und mein Verhalten so ausrichte, dass ich mich ihnen angleiche. Letztes Jahr stellte ich während eines Literaturfestivals in Tokio fest, dass ich respektvoll nicke, als mir jemand auf der Straße den Weg zeigte, obwohl ich in Wirklichkeit kein einziges Wort von dem verstand, was er sagte. Ich frage mich, ob ich es irgendwie genieße, für einen Einheimischen gehalten zu werden, so wie ich frustriert bin, wenn niemand zu wissen scheint oder wissen will, woher ich komme. In manchen Ländern wie Thailand, wo ich ein paar einfache Sätze aneinander reinkam, ertappe ich mich dabei, den Akzent der Einheimischen nachzuahmen, was die Leute noch mehr verwirrt. Aber es macht sie auch glücklich. Kommt aufs Gleiche raus, antworten die Thais fröhlich, wenn meine Identität endlich aufgedeckt wird und ziehen mit dem Zeigefinger einen Kreis um ihr Gesicht. Mein Gesicht ist ihr Gesicht. Es kommt alles aufs Gleiche raus. Vielleicht hat es gar nichts mit unseren Gesichtern zu tun, sondern mit unserem Wunsch, dass alle so sein sollen wie wir. Wir wollen, dass der Fremde einer von uns ist, jemand, den wir verstehen können.
Thank you very much, Chantal. Tash, you wrote the first version of this book more than 10 years ago, and then you revisited it and republished it in 2021. And since then you have given many talks and thought about it and moved on maybe. I would like to start by asking you, how has your relationship with this book changed over the years?
I first wrote it as a response to someone who asked me to write an essay about my face, which is why the first part of the book is called The Face. And very quickly, I realized I wouldn't be able to write a story of my face without writing also the story of the people who gave me that face, so the people around me, from whose surroundings I was born, because my story seemed to be inextricably linked with theirs and theirs with mine. It was impossible for me to isolate my story from theirs. And I knew I had to write their story as part of my own. And the more I thought about this, the more troubled I began to feel by it, because, you know, for anyone who has grown up in an Asian family, particularly I think a Chinese family has to be said, it's very, very hard, you know, especially with people of my generation, but I think also younger people, it's very hard to establish clear lines of communication. And even when my parents said, yes, okay, fine, stop bothering us, we will, tomorrow, after lunch, we'll sit down and we'll talk about it. They just never gave me any answers. It's so, it's you know, people say it's cultural, maybe it is, I don't know. But I think it's more emotional. I think it is something to do with people of that generation, people who are immigrants. I think it's very important that they are immigrants, because immigrants have a sort of a history that generally they want to forget, because they don't want this to be passed on to their children. They want their children to have a new start, to feel as if they're the same as everyone else. And the more I thought about this, the more it became difficult for me to articulate this in a long text. And so over the years, I've been thinking about this book, and I'm now writing the follow-up to it, about how to articulate a response to something that really has no answer. So for most people who read this book, expecting a family memoir, expecting me, and you know, I say in some parts of the book that I'm going to talk to my father. And I sit down with him and I put the iPhone recorder on, and the moment the recorder goes on, there's a blank, it's just dead. And the memoir is something we expect to give us answers. So in a typical memoir, an American memoir, I would sit down with my father, and then, you know, he'd tell me about his life, and I'll tell him about my life, and we'll reach an understanding, we'll cry, we'll fall into, we'll have a hug. And at the end of my story, there is still a huge silence. There is still so much I don't know, and there is still so much that I now have to accept I'm not going to know. It's just not going to happen. And so the story of my family is a story of silence. And this is something that I've had to get used to over the years, that how is it that I'm a writer? It's my job to write about these things. It's my job to write about people. You know, I've been training myself for the last 3 decades to do this. I'm still not able to do this. So, you know, it's one of these books that makes me wonder what it is to be a writer and why I'm writing. Because I'm writing in order to capture these stories. And if I can't capture these stories, does that mean I'm failing?
So do you think you failed with this book?
I think I failed with the project that I started out, which is to find answers. But in a funny sort of way, the failure has become a success, as isn't so often in life. You know, the people who are often seen as the failures when they're children, you know, the people who are seen as weak, who are seen as deficient in all sorts of different ways, they are the ones who survive. And it's actually the same in a way with so many immigrant families who arrive in a new country and they don't have the skills, they don't have the language skills even, they don't know the codes of conduct, they don't have the manners, but in the end, quite often they have the resilience. So in some way, what I wanted to do was to capture my parents' story, because, you know, it's very important to this project that I capture the lives of people who didn't see themselves as having a place in literature. So this was very, very important to me. And all my writing is about this. Because when over the years, when I've written my first novel was about people who resemble my grandparents, who lived in rural Malaysia, in small towns on the edge of the jungle. And my parents found out that they read interviews that I gave, and they said, well, why are you bothering to write about people like this? I mean, these people are not important. You know, why don't you write about more important people? And so what they did was actually, when I was growing up, one of the things that really frustrated me was in all the things I read. So even the books that were set in Malaysia, I never saw people like me. I never recognized anyone in, you know, novels of Somerset Maugham or J.G. Ballard even. You know, I never saw people whose lives resembled the lives of my parents or my grandparents. And in a funny sort of way, I now understand why. Because my parents, like so many people of their background, not highly educated, slightly embarrassed about being, very embarrassed about having been deprived in early childhood, they don't want that to be seen in literature. They don't feel they have a place in literature, and therefore they are in collusion with the rest of literature to marginalize people like them. You know, it's often said that the bourgeoisie has two lives. You know, one is their real life, and the second life is the life that is immortalized in literature. Because when you look at literature, the history of world literature, it is overwhelmingly middle class. It's overwhelmingly Western. And what is important to me as a writer is to carve out a space for people like my parents, who are not like me. You know, people like me, I have an education. And once you have an education, it gives you a certain way of thinking about the world. It gives you a certain way of thinking about yourself. You talk endlessly about yourself, you know, as I'm doing now. But my parents are the complete reverse. And someone needed, I think, to capture their story. And this is my attempt to do it. Only the question is, have I succeeded or have I not?
So, have your parents read your book? And what was their review?
Well, it's very difficult to know. I know they have read it. It's very difficult to know what they think of it. You know, my parents are not the kind of people who are going to ring me up and say, in tears, to say, I'm so touched by what you wrote and the rest of it. But this is not going to happen. I know at some level they are moved by it because they talk about it with friends, or they're proud when friends talk about it. But they themselves, I tell you, so when the first version of the book was published, and this is illustrative of so much of what the story is about, I said to my mother that, you know, really, it was very small, like half the size of this. And part of the reason I wanted a small book was, you know, my parents read English, but they're Chinese educated, so I think they're more comfortable in Chinese. Their English is fine, but, you know, even for people who read English comfortably, reading a 200 or 300 page novel, as my novels tend to be, it requires stamina. You know, even if you're reading in your native language, it's not easy. So I wanted to write something small that they and all the people I actually was at school with, all the people I grew up with, could read easily, quickly. So I said to my mother, you know, it's about your family. I think you should read it. And so she read it, and she said, yeah, it's fine. I rang her, and she said, it's fine. And I write about this in the second part of the novel, of the memoir. She said, it's fine, but you got one detail wrong, because, you know, when you said that your grandfather came to Malaysia on his own, by himself, from Fujian province in China, that was wrong. He came with another boy from his village. They were both 15 years old. And the reason she knew this was because one day, when she was a child, they got a call from the local psychiatric hospital, which is a very grim place called Tanjung Rambutan. If anyone knows, it's a very grim, horrible kind of Victorian psychiatric hospital. And this man was found wandering in the street, and he had nothing with him, no shoes, nothing, barely dressed. But he had my grandfather's name and number. He said he was going to come, wanted to see my grandfather. My grandmother said, no, we don't want this man in our house. You know, he's going to bring bad luck to us. But my grandfather insisted, because he said, this boy is from my village. You know, this man is from my village. He's my last link to China, so we have to invite him in. It's old traditions. So he came in, he sat in a chair in the corner, didn't talk to anyone, didn't eat anything for 2 days, and on the third day he killed himself. And so my mother's telling me this over the phone in a very matter-of-fact way to prove how I was wrong in one of my details. Because how would I know that this person existed? Because I'd never been told about him. And so I said, well, why didn't you tell this story to me before? And she said, it's so boring. Why do you want to know about this? It's so boring. And that sums up, everything. It's a story of deprivation, poverty, suffering, madness. And those are stories that don't sit well in what she wants me to think our family has been. And so, when I hear now, I've been living in Britain and in Europe for nearly 2 or 3 decades now, I keep hearing conservative, reactionary politicians talk about how these immigrants, they hate this country. They all want to just talk about where they're from. They have this romanticized version of where they're from. I mean, my experience is completely the opposite. That actually there is no romance, and that the link needs to be cut very, very severely, in such a severe way that the people who follow have no idea where they're from. And for people who say, but isn't that a good thing? Well, actually, it might be from a political point of view, it might be from a sociological point of view, from a human point of view. I think it's very devastating, because how do you explain, for example, the levels of mental health issues that people like in my own family have suffered? You can't explain this without situating this as in part of a wider context. And actually, I think even though my parents and my relatives are not able to reach out to me, as people say now, they can't reach out to me, and express what they feel, I think there is some, I'm not going to say gratitude, because I don't think it's gratitude. I think there's some sort of relief to see that actually someone acknowledges what their lives have been like.
But is there also a part in you that understands your mother's reaction in a way that you think, maybe I should not go there, maybe I should not tell these horrible stories of my family members who killed their life, or friends?
Yeah, of course there is. I mean, and I had to, I was brought up in that family. I was brought up with that same kind of sense of, more than just reserve. It's not reserve. It's more that sense of embarrassment, that sense of shame, even that sense of protecting the silence. But those are things that I think work in collusion with all the other forces, with all the other political forces that want to invalidate families like mine, make them invisible, that I have, as a writer, tried to fight against. There is a lot of politically, it's very difficult to describe for anyone who is not from the country. To be Chinese is a very, very strange thing. I mean, you're living what seems to be a normal life in a country that does not give you the same political, social rights as everybody else. And so on the surface, you can go to school. On the surface, you can work in a job. On the surface, you can make money. But ultimately, there will come a point where you realize that you do not have the same rights as other people who live in the country.
Do you recall the time when you realized that you don't have the same rights, that you are actually an immigrant?
The first time I realized I came from an immigrant family was when I was about 5 or 6. And I describe this in the book, where someone else, the people who was on the street, who told me to go back to China. And I really, as a child, I really had no idea they were talking to me. I thought they were talking to somebody else. I thought it was like the tourists from Beijing, who had missed their plane. I can remember this quite clearly. It was only after like 3 or 4 times you hear this and you realize, actually, okay, well, maybe this means that I'm not really Malaysian. I mean, what does this mean? But you still can't really feel it. You can't really believe it until you're about 15 or 16 or 17. Then you get to the business end of school, where you basically have to go to universities. And suddenly you realize that other people are getting scholarships that you're not even eligible for. So this is a really curious situation to be in, because all around you, you see Chinese people having a kind of a normal life. So, the other reason why Giovanni's room, you asked me earlier, right, going back to your first question about Baldwin, and when David, the main character in Giovanni's room, when I read it, I just assumed that he was a stand-in for Baldwin, and then the line where he talks about looking into the mirror and seeing his blonde hair and blue eyes made me really. It was very, very jarring for me. And what was really affecting was reading in interviews where Baldwin was asked why he didn't make this, why he didn't make the character African American, and he said that to talk about two things so difficult for him in one book would have been too difficult. So to talk about homosexuality and to talk about being black were two issues that were just too weighty and too difficult and too complicated. And it really resonated for me because, way long before I had any idea of sexuality, and what it meant to be queer, and before I knew already that the world hated queer people, I already knew they hated Chinese people, and this is what it was. This was what first struck me growing up in Malaysia. There was, which is not to say that people always find this very threatening when I talk about this in Malaysia. Which is not to say, I have a lot of friends from, who are ethnically Malay, religiously Muslim. We're very close. But at the same time, there is a structure that legally and politically does not allow ethnic minorities, not just Chinese, also Indians, to achieve equality before the law. And so when you grow up in this framework, it's a very curious thing. And my parents really never wanted to address this. It's their reality, and it was their right not to address this. Because I think when you live in a society like that, you just have to survive. You have to do what you need to do to survive, and I can see, in answer to your question, I could see why they didn't want me to grow up with persecution complex. But the problem is that you have that complex whether or not you're taught it. Other people teach it to you. The whole country teaches it to you. So whether you like it or not, you grow up with it.
You write a lot in the book about the crunching or the crushing part of your upbringing, but also of a supportive part. So there's the good and the bad at the same time. And I wanted to know, because of your background as the son or the grandson of Chinese immigrants, being brought up in Kuala Lumpur, then moving to Europe, I often, when I talk to immigrants, I myself come from Finland, so I moved here in Switzerland, and I always find it interesting to see which aspects of your home culture do I hold on to and which do I let go of. And it sometimes surprises me what I hold on to and which I don't care about. What aspects are you holding on to from your Chinese background, and what are you happy to get rid of?
I don't think that we're free from the grip of our childhood. I think we can. I think we can make conscious choices to change ourselves, but so much we can't ever be totally free. I've been reading Simone de Beauvoir's memoir about the death of her mother, and she says very clearly in that we're never nothing ever abolishes childhood, and I think that my whole attitude towards where I come from and my childhood it's a continuous exercise to see. I'm always very surprised at how much I retain, despite my having spent many years trying to change myself. I think it's the bond with my family comes from language, it comes from developed a certain understanding of culture. And I mean culture not as in like formal sense of culture, but a kind of an ethnic sense of culture. And, you know, it's very difficult for me to, what I wanted, all the time I thought that that I was being more modern in wanting to speak about things that I was not brought up with. So wanting to be more direct, wanting to be freer, what I thought was freer. I'm not sure now whether I was able to achieve that, because the whole point of doing that is to change the people that you surround yourself with, that you are surrounded by. And if I can't even talk to my parents freely, how much of myself have I actually changed? Mm-hmm. And that's why I think being a writer is a very freeing thing. It's a very liberating thing, because on the page I feel free to do things that I'm not able to do in real life.
That's interesting. You write this one part, you write, let me see, to be modern in Asia today, you're required to detach yourself from the past and live only in the present, without considering the people who shaped you. But at the same time, you say this is impossible. So people who do, are people able to do that? Or are they just
people
lying
think
to
that
themselves?
they do that. I mean, they think that by destroying all the buildings in a particular city and reconstructing them in a really horrible modern commercial capitalist way, that they are changing their history. But they haven't internally done any work from that. They should go and see your mother. You know, they need to be able to do work to sort of change themselves. That just reconstructing the outside doesn't mean that any internal change has happened. So if you take a country like Malaysia, as an example, Kuala Lumpur now, if you go to Kuala Lumpur, it's completely physically completely different from what it was when I was growing up. Topography is not the same. The layout of the city is not the same. Every external element has been the same. So the narrative, when you look at the city, is that we are a modern city. We are a modern country. But when you look at all the institutional laws, all the institutional structures, they are exactly the same as they were before, and possibly even more backward than they were. So you can do everything. You can reshape this narrative, which is that, you know, we are so modern, we're so great, you know, that we all drive cars, you know, we have all these fancy malls, we sell all the same international brands you find everywhere else. But actually, how do we think of women? How do we think of ethnic minorities? How do we think of anyone who is excluded? How do you think of foreign workers, migrant workers? None of that has changed. So yeah, there is a problem with our thinking of modernity, what modernity means, and whether we can move on.
Mm-hmm. It's not exclusively a problem of Malaysia. We find that everywhere, right?
No, of course, but you know, I think when you look at what the way Asia, modern Southeast Asia, has changed physically, there is an assumption that means it's modern. Whereas I think, you know, you can't destroy half of Zurich and rebuild it in like a shopping mall. This is not going to happen and say you're modern. I think the modernity in Asia is presumed to be attached to how much people can buy and how much people can spend. And this is not real modernity.
Let's move on to the next reading passage. So that's Chantal again.
Trotz ihrer scheinbaren Zurückhaltung waren die Menschen in Großbritannien immer noch imstande, mich hin und wieder zu verstören. Vor allem, wenn sie über ihre Familien sprachen. Einige Kommilitonen, die, soweit ich das beurteilen konnte, der soliden Mittelschicht angehörten, beklagten sich darüber, dass sie während ihres Gap Years, also dem freien Jahr vor Beginn der Universität, Miete an ihre Eltern hatten zahlen müssen. Eine solche kommerzielle Transaktion schien mir kalt und rücksichtslos. Trotzdem musste ich so tun, als fände ich es völlig normal, dass Eltern auch Vermieter sein können. Gemäß einer Vereinbarung, nach der Verwandtschaft auch berechnend und in aller Stille feindselig werden kann. Eine Vereinbarung, bei der als Gegenleistung für die Erledigung diverser häuslicher Pflichten Mietnachlässe für das Zimmer, in dem man seit seiner Kindheit gewohnt hätte, gewahrt werden können. Einmal unterhielt ich mich mit ein paar Freunden, darunter einer Malaysierin, die ich am Check-in-Schalter des Flughafens Subang kennengelernt hatte und mit der ich seitdem befreundet war. Eine andere Freundin von mir, eine weiße Britin aus Dulwich, dachte laut über die komplizierte Beziehung zu ihren Eltern nach. Während ihrer Kindheit und Jugend habe sie die Beziehung immer für völlig normal gehalten. Jetzt aber merke sie, dass es ganz anders war. Ihre Eltern hatten ihr nicht oft erlaubt, mit ihren Freunden auszugehen. Sie liebten sie, hatte sie gesagt, und wollten sie beschützen. Ihr Bruder, der älter und freier war, durfte sein Leben so leben, wie er wollte, mit elterlicher Unterstützung, wenn er sie brauchte. Nicht, dass ihre Eltern ihm gegenüber besonders nachsichtig gewesen wären oder sowas, aber sie erinnerte sich, dass sie ihn behandelten wie einen Erwachsenen. Sie ließen ihm die Wahl, fragten nach seiner Meinung. Erst kürzlich habe sie mit Hilfe einer Therapie das Offensichtliche erkannt. Ihr Vater liebte sie zu sehr, ihre Mutter liebte sie überhaupt nicht. Jetzt war sie erwachsen und brauchte ihre Liebe nicht mehr. Trotzdem sehnte sich ein Teil von ihr danach. Allmählich gehe ihr auf, so sagte sie, dass ihre Mutter sie emotional verkorkst habe. Alle äußerten vorsichtige Zustimmung. Ich dagegen wusste nicht, was ich sagen sollte. Wir kannten uns seit weniger als einem Jahr und ich war mir unsicher, wie ich reagieren sollte. Ich sah meine malaysische Freundin an und sie, die ich zu Hause für extrovertiert und mutig gehalten hatte, blickte in ihre Teetasse. Unsere gemeinsame Verlegenheit machte uns zu Verbündeten. Wir waren fasziniert und erschrocken zugleich über die Enthüllung familiärer Beziehung in aller Öffentlichkeit, die uns gleichzeitig vor Augen führte, wie wir selbst innerhalb unserer Familien kommunizierten. Meine Freundin war mutiger als ich und sagte schließlich, »Aber du redest doch über deine Mutter.« Unsere Freundin lachte und zuckte mit den Schultern. »Eben, es ist verkorkst, wie gesagt.« Später auf dem Weg in unsere jeweilige Unterkunft versuchten meine malaysische Freundin und ich, unsere vorübergehende Verlegenheit mit kulturellen Unterschieden abzutun. Das ist nur die westliche Kultur, versicherten wir uns. In Asien kommunizieren wir anders.
Thank you very much. I can relate very good to this because in Finland it's an absolute no-go to say your family is fucked up. You cannot say that. They are, but you cannot say that publicly. It's impossible. It's the worst thing you can do. But why? Where does this shame come from?
I mean, I in Finland, I don't know.
No. I mean,
you know, I think it's possibly, in my case, I think it comes from, it's said to come from Confucian philosophy, which reveres a family structure, which preserves that. But in more general terms, I think it's to do with a sense of hierarchy, and I think Asian people have a very clear sense of hierarchy, which, I mean, even when, and this applies not just to the family, but if you see the family as being the closest unit of society, the rules that you apply within your family are also applied to wider society. So teachers, the police, the government. It's really, I think, people have difficulty questioning structures of power, structures of authority. But of course, you know, things change, and I think, you know, people now are much more, I think, thankfully, certainly in the political sense, much more, much happier much freer to express anger and resentment. But the family, I think, because it's so close and so basic, feels as if you're criticizing the family in some way, you're criticizing parts of yourself. Still don't know quite how to do that. I think worse than criticizing yourself, I think it's admitting that something is very, very deeply wrong. yeah, and I think that's all I can offer as an explanation. I think every family is different. I think I'm surprised to hear that in Finland it's a blanket ban, because even I think in Asia now, I wouldn't have thought it's so. In public, I think there's also the other thing about things being discussed in public. I think in private, people have arguments, people have disputes, but it's about that thing of making a private issue public. And so, your question is very pertinent. What do people think about writing this book about airing dirty laundry in public? I think people were initially very hesitant. Some of my friends who I was at school with, who went on to university, in some cases university in the West, as I did, rang me and said, do you not feel uncomfortable or embarrassed doing it? And my answer was, of course I feel embarrassed doing it. I have the same upbringing as you. We are taught to be embarrassed about doing this, but embarrassment is one of these things that is often used to trap people in places they don't really want to be. I remember when I was a child and hearing my mother and other women in the family talk about we'd see articles on women in America and in Europe fighting for female equality, and my mother and other women were, I know they agreed with them, but there was something about these images being broadcast on our TVs in our living rooms, which are such private spaces, that made everyone feel uncomfortable. And my mother was saying, these women, they shouldn't be making a spectacle of themselves. What are they doing? Why are they doing this in public? Sort of screaming on the street. It seems so but it's precisely that sense of embarrassment that then led to women having greater rights. And so for me as a writer, it's always been very important to challenge a sense of embarrassment, to challenge a sense of what can be said and what can't be said, which is not just political censorship, it's social censorship. It's sort of an informal censorship, things you should say or shouldn't say. And that's why I think I became a writer, because I knew that perhaps in a verbal way, in a public way, I wouldn't be able to do this. But in a written way, even though the book becomes public, within its pages, it's just me and the book, and I can say what I want.
Good, you did. I sometimes think we spend too much time obsessing about our families and too little about our friends. Do you agree or disagree?
I think that people don't spend enough time obsessing about their families in the correct way. I think when we're concerned about our families, we're always concerned about conserving a certain order. And this is where friends are very important, because friends offer you an alternative. So if you want to live in any other way than a strictly kind of traditional heteronormative way, friends are basically the only way not to live like that. But that model can then be used to think about families in a more constructive and a more freeing way. Because I think, in a sense, families get stuck in a rut. You have certain patterns of behavior, and then you can never change them because everyone around you is behaving in the same way, and it seems that it's inevitable. For the longest time, I thought my parents were they were normal. And it's not until I saw how other people, and all their friends were equally dysfunctional. And it's only when I left that kind of model to live in a different way that I realized there's something fundamentally wrong. All the time I was living in Malaysia, I never thought that the political system was anything strange. I never thought that giving certain racial groups political privilege, social privilege over others, I didn't think that was abnormal. I mean, I I thought it was a bit cruel on the other people, but I thought that it was just in some way that was what the world was, and it wasn't until I left Malaysia that I thought actually this is very, very strange. It wasn't until I started reading James Baldwin, I started reading Toni Morrison, that I realized that there are ways to think about the structure in which we live, the societies in which we live, the families in which we live. There are other ways of thinking about this, that we could stop complaining about this in exactly the same way and think about how we can change this. And that's why the book is a challenge. It's a challenge to the real, the first unit of society, which is the family, to think about what it says about itself. When you communicate to your children and your grandchildren what success is, what the meaning of failure is, what are you really communicating to them? If you're saying to a child that someone who has had psychiatric illnesses, like my uncles had, because apparently this is something that I only learned when I was about 35, that it's a kind of a hereditary disease in my family, and it affects the male members of my family. Those men have to be forgotten. They're just really not talked about because they're failures. And their failure, in inverted commas, is the fact that they were sick. What are you saying about your culture, about your family? People like that are excluded. What does it mean for a family or a country to be successful? So when you look at the way part of the novel tries to link the way we talk about families with the way we talk about nations. When a country like Malaysia or Singapore talks about being very successful, what they basically mean is that we're economically successful. And that economic success, actually, when you look at it closely, applies only to a section of society. It doesn't apply to another section, a huge section of society that is excluded. And so when you're talking about a family or a country, what you really mean, so when my family talks about how, well, we're all very successful now, what they mean is that one cousin who became a lawyer and that one cousin who became a doctor and all the others who are working in factories, well, they're forgotten. We don't want to talk about them. They don't need to exist in this book. The uncle who was sent to psychiatric hospital, the other uncle who killed himself, his son who killed himself, they don't need to be talked about. Their lives don't count for anything. So when we talk about KL, Kuala Lumpur, when you look at these skyscrapers, what we talk about are the skyscrapers. We don't talk about all the people who built them, who lived lives of incredible deprivation and who were kicked out of the country as soon as they finished their contract to build that building. So the narrative is not complete. The narrative needs to be multi-layered. It needs to be rich with all the details of suffering, because the suffering is also a form of success.
Building upon that, how do you, for yourself, define literary or artistic success?
For me, literary or artistic success is something that is as truthful it can be. I wouldn't say everything is truthful. You can't have complete truth. But when you look at a book that tries to be truthful, that tries to speak of something different and tries to speak of something uncomfortable, which makes people feel uncomfortable, that is, I think, a sign of success. Books that are very easy, that you read and you kind of, admire, but you forget 2 days later, those I don't think are successful books. I think the mark of artistic success is that, not that it changes life. I think that's too grand an ambition to hold. I think we, as writers, we always think that we can write a book and it changes society. Very few books can do that. Very few writers can do that. But what they can be, every writer and every book they write, is to be truthful and to be in some way disruptive, even if that disruption only applies to the writer themselves or a small group of people around them, which is what I've tried to do all my life. You know, I don't really need to write for many people. What I need is for my books to be read by the people around me, and for them to feel agitated, for them to have some kind of response. I don't need them to agree with it, but I need them to have some kind of response.
Well, you managed to do that with me at least, because when I read it, I told you before that I was reading it at my mother's place, and she was reading it too, and I felt the urgent need to be more truthful with her. I didn't follow through, but
Did you criticize her in a Finnish way?
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I said, I love your food.
Yeah.
But I felt this need because you did that. And this is something the book did to me, so thank you for that. Time's running out, so let's have another reading section and introduce the favorite person in the book, for me at least.
Wir dachten, wir würden dich tot vorfinden. Stattdessen sitzt du neben mir, lebendiger als je zuvor. Erst vor 2 Wochen waren meine Eltern und ich aus Kuala Lumpur gekommen, um nach dir zu sehen. Mehr als 3 Stunden Fahrt durch den dichten Verkehr, bis wir die kleine ländliche Stadt erreichten, wo du seit fast 60 Jahren lebst und ich alle meine Schulferien mit dir verbrachte. Zu diesem Zeitpunkt warst du schon sehr krank. Der Krebs hatte sich so weit ausgebreitet, dass niemand sicher war, welcher Teil deines Körpers dir die größten Schmerzen bereitete. Ich verbrachte eine halbe Stunde mit dir, saß an deinem Bett, während du schliefst. Deine Lippen waren rissig und du hattest so viel Gewicht verloren, dass deine Wangen bis auf die Knochen eingefallen waren. Du warst nie besonders groß, aber jetzt, reglos im Bett, sahst du aus wie ein Kind. Meine Mutter blieb nur ein paar Minuten bei dir. »Was soll das bringen?«, sagte sie. »Deine Großmutter weiß nicht mal, dass wir hier sind.« Viel später gab sie mir gegenüber zu, dass sie deinen Anblick an der Schwelle zum Tod nicht hatte ertragen können. Es war stickig im Raum, sie bekam kaum Luft. Als ich mich gestern Abend darauf vorbereitete, das Land zu verlassen, eine Lesereise und andere berufliche Verpflichtungen würden mich einige Monate von zu Hause fernhalten, rief Onkel C. sehr spät an, um uns mitzuteilen, dass es mit dir zu Ende ginge. Es lohne sich nicht zu kommen, er wollte uns nur Bescheid sagen. Aber wir fuhren trotzdem für ein paar Tage zurück, um deine Beerdigung vorzubereiten und deine Angelegenheiten zu regeln. Eine seltsame Leichtigkeit würde über dem Haus hängen, Melancholie, vermischt mit einem Gefühl von Erleichterung über dein Ableben, so wie vor 2 Jahrzehnten, als Argon starb und du selbst sagtest, wenigstens hat er jetzt keine Schmerzen mehr. Wir bogen in die Seitenstraße ein, in der es immer nach Hühnerkacke stinkt, und ich erinnere mich an dieses Gefühl von Einsamkeit, das ich hatte, wenn ich als Kind in den Schulferien zu dir kam, weit weg von meinem Leben in der Stadt. Ich wünschte, ich könnte gefühlvoller über die nostalgische Rückkehr ins Familiendorf sprechen, aber so war ich nicht. Onkel C. wartete draußen auf der Straße auf uns und schirmte seine Augen gegen die Mittagssonne ab. »Irgendwas Seltsames geht hier vor«, sagte er. Wir gingen in die Küche und du hast neben dem Kessel gestanden und darauf gewartet, dass das Wasser kocht. Du hattest ein Handtuch um den Hals geschlungen, dein Haar, wie immer lockig und schwarz gefärbt, war frisch gewaschen und du hattest eine neue Bluse und eine dunkle Hose angezogen. Du hast versucht, den Kessel vom Herd zu heben, aber es fehlte die Kraft, deine Beine zitterten vor Anstrengung. Es war, als hättest du nicht bemerkt, dass dich dein Körper im Stich gelassen hatte. »Es ist Wochen her, dass sie aufstehen konnte«, flüsterte Onkel C. Du hast aufgeblickt und uns gesehen. »Komm, komm«, sagtest du, nanntest mich bei meinem kindlichen Spitznamen. »Du hast bestimmt Durst. Granny macht dir Tee.« Du sprachst von dir in der 3. Person, wie du es immer getan hattest. Es war, als hätten wir uns während der vergangenen 3 Jahrzehnte jede Woche gesehen, als gäbe es keine Kluft zwischen uns. Du hast mich ins Wohnzimmer geführt und dich neben mich auf das mit Plastik überzogene Sofa gesetzt. Deine Augen waren gerötet und müde, Aber du warst immer noch begierig auf Gesellschaft. Ich hörte, wie sich meine Eltern im Zimmer nebenan leise eindringlich mit Onkel C unterhielten, aber ich konnte nicht verstehen, was sie sagten, weil ich mich auf deine Stimme konzentrierte. Es ist dieser Augenblick, einerseits zu kurz, andererseits irgendwie unendlich, der mir in diesen Tagen von Zeit zu Zeit wieder einfällt, wenn ich auf den Bus wartete oder kurz vor dem Einschlafen bin. Du sprichst mit mir, dein Gesicht strahlt vor Freude, am Leben zu sein, obgleich du weißt, dass du sterben wirst. Du sprichst mit einer Freiheit, die ich noch nie an dir bemerkt habe, erzählst mir Dinge über meinen Großvater, über dich, Details, die nicht mal meiner Mutter bekannt sein dürften. Das liegt daran, dass du Granny so nahe standest, wird sie später sagen, aber in Wirklichkeit ist das Gegenteil der Fall. Du erzählst mir diese Dinge, weil wir uns auseinandergelebt haben, und manchmal ist es einfacher, Vertraulichkeiten mit einem Fremden zu besprechen. Bei diesem Gespräch, von dem wir beide wissen, dass es unser letztes sein wird, nur du und ich, wird mir klar, dass die Geschichte unserer Beziehung eine der Trennung ist. Unsere Nähe misst sich an der Entfernung zwischen uns.
My personal theory is that we all have one relative that we can connect with. Sometimes that is a distant relative, not our parents or our sisters or brothers. And I assume this must have been your grandmother for you. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of a relationship did you have?
I had a very close relationship with her, but not in the sense that we spent all our time together. I grew up half in the city in Kuala Lumpur and half in the countryside where she lived with my grandfather and my cousins. And I would spend all my school holidays with them. I was sent to live with them. And she was always very busy running the household. They were people of not, they were not very wealthy, so they weren't like dirt poor either, but I really got a sense of someone who was always struggling to make sure the house was clean, to make sure everything was cooked in time for the meals. My grandfather ran a little a store in the village, and so she also worked in the store. I also worked in the store. Everyone worked in the store, and we were all so busy doing our own thing that we really didn't have time to sit down and talk and establish the kind of closeness that you would recognize as closeness. But despite that, I always knew that she and I had a connection. She was, a Chinese woman of her generation, which means that she was not afforded any of the advantages that a boy might have had. So she had no education. She wasn't sent to school at all, and yet she was very bright. She had taught herself how to read, and also taught herself how to read some English. And she would understand things very quickly, and she would also understand emotional states very quickly. My grandfather didn't care. He really very, very, very distant and very hard. And I never knew what was going on inside him. Whereas with my grandmother, I could tell when she was tired. I could tell when she was sad, and she was much more, I think, understanding of me and my efforts. I was very different from my male cousins. I never wanted to go out and kill animals and things like that. I just wanted to stay in and read. And in the shop, I was always given the part of the shop to look after that was basically the least work. It's also the most effeminate. I looked after all the bits selling combs and soap and shampoo and stuff like that, because basically I could read. I could spend all my time reading, and she understood that. She somehow understood that reading was important to me. But by the time I was 12 or 13, I really knew that if I didn't want to end up in that village, like my cousins or a lot of the people I was growing up with, that I would really need to do well at school. And it was a struggle because I wasn't naturally good at school. And because I was spending more and more time reading, trying to watch movies and trying to learn how to read, long books in foreign languages, I just didn't have time to spend with her. And it was only much later on in my life that and she was also increasing, she was getting older and so more frail. It wasn't until much later on in our lives when I realized that actually what we had shared was a bond that was very special. And when she was dying, she had cancer. I was already a professional writer, and I was doing a lot of touring for my first novel, and I was away a lot. It wasn't easy for me to go to Malaysia, and it wasn't easy for me to want to in Malaysia. They live in a very rural area, so it's you go quite a long way to see them. And it really wasn't until she was almost dying that I went to see her, and I realized that. And we had this incredibly, over the course of 1 or 2 days, we had incredibly open conversation where she told me things about her life and about her marriage to my grandfather, which were very, very, to me, shockingly frank. And so the tables were turned. She was telling me all these things about how, basically my grandfather, she was saying how my grandfather loved her very much, but was not a good husband. And in an Asian family, we were talking about it, this felt so radical, felt so challenging that I was the one who felt embarrassed. And that's why, I had thought I'm now a writer, I can talk about these things, I can handle emotional states. But actually, how much of ourselves that we lose and we leave behind is debatable, because I found that I didn't know how to handle what she was telling me. And that essentially, affectionately, physically, sexually, he wasn't very good. And this is, very embarrassing to hear. And I realized that actually it was precisely the fact that I had grown distant from her. I was now almost a separate person. I was a writer. These people didn't exist in our world. I was almost like some outside person who had come to take her record, a record of what her life was, to somehow capture it in a private space that would be a book that she wouldn't have to see. But it was precisely the fact that we had grown separate that enabled her to have this conversation with me. Whereas, with my cousins, with whom she lived, she saw them every single day. There was no way she could have had that conversation, I don't think.
Yeah, you use this beautiful line of saying our closeness is measured in the distance between us, which I thought about a lot. It's something that we forget. We think closeness is closeness, but it's maybe not.
Well, it's also, just going back to the second passage that you read, where, the whole talking about emotional things within a family space in a very frank and very open way is an attempt to sort of have this, create this bridge between generations. And it's a very Western thing to us. It seems like a very Western thing. And I had heard so many Western people say to me, in Asian families, you don't really have our closeness. You don't really speak to each other. And it made me think that actually the closeness is measured by a different means in families such as mine. So we were always struggling. My parents were always struggling to make ends meet. They were always working. They were always under stress. And given those such circumstances, they weren't able to express, and also they didn't have the education. They didn't have the reading that I have, or that Western middle class people have. They don't read books in which people say certain things, so they don't know how to say it themselves. It's completely conditioning by class, by education. So they weren't able to give that to us. But what they did do was, and this is something I've realized much later, is that actually the love, so now I live in France, where people are always telling each other that they love each other all the time, like in public.
Here's a spoiler, they don't.
Yeah, okay. And it's the very opposite from the kind of family that I grew up in. But the love is expressed quite often in the sacrifice that is made for the families. and the love is sacrifice, and the sacrifice is measured in physical distance. So, you know, a lot of the time, my parents, I didn't see them for days, for months, because, you know, they were going somewhere else to find work. And you can see extreme examples of this now. You know, and I talk about this in the book, where I was on the bus in Singapore, and a Filipina domestic worker was talking to her child on Skype. You know, and these are women who leave their children. And the woman was in tears. You know, you see your child growing up on Skype. The love that you have for them requires you to move your body to a different country and not see them for many months and probably actually many years. Reality is in many years. I don't see how that is a lesser love than two Parisian people telling each other 5 times over the course of dinner that they love each other. I can't see how that is a lesser love. So, you know, the distance between me and my grandparents, between my grandparents and my parents and me, that is also a measure of love. It's just a very different measure.
Thank you so much. Beautiful final words. But I would like to open up. We have a couple of minutes left for questions from the audience. If there's something you would like to ask, you can think about it now. I will ask you one question while you think. The book is called Strangers on a Pier, and this refers to your grandfathers who stood as strangers on a pier, approximately 50 years old, in Malaysia, coming from China. If you could go back in time, what would you like to ask these 2 young men?
Don't know. I mean, I would be speechless. I think this is the whole thing, that, you know, we're approaching this subject with 70 years of hindsight, 70 years of thinking about the act of immigration, 70 years of thinking about what it means to be dislocated, deracinated. They didn't have that. They wouldn't have been able, for them, I think words would have been superfluous. Because when you're 15 years old and you've just arrived from Fujian province on a boat that you don't even know is going to get to where you're going to, you don't even know where that place is. I really think you're just shell-shocked. I think you have no words to say. If someone comes and asks you something, I don't think you respond. I don't think you know how to respond. And I think that any formulation of a response is so troubling to your act of survival, because your act of survival is foremost, is everything. You know, the next few days, weeks, months are just going to be about surviving. And you can't think of, oh, how do I feel right now? How do I? Because of course the answer is I feel terrified. I feel, you know, I feel shell-shocked. I'm traumatized. And so I would have nothing to say to people like that. I would have really nothing to say. And I think it would be out of place to say something. And because I know, so I think I imagine what that mentality is like, and so much of it was about withholding. You have to withhold what you feel and therefore what you express in order to be able to survive. That instinct is carried over through the years, and it's carried through over the generations. It's carried through when you have children. You've held in so much that you now don't know what to say to them. So, you know, it's really a question of circumstance, I think. So I don't think I could really say anything to that.
Are there questions from the audience? It's over there.
Thank you for this beautiful evening. It was very inspirational and emotional. My question to you would be, how and when did you start writing, and what kept you going until you got published?
When it's a very good question. Like, the answer might be a little bit long. I'll try and keep it short. I was sort of a slightly angry young man, and I was really, when I got to university in Britain, I looked at what the Southeast Asian novel was, and I realized that what the Southeast Asian novel was not really Southeast Asian. It was basically a British colonial novel, which is not to say that they can't be interesting, but they just weren't. I think they might have been in the hands of different people, but they just were not. And so, like a lot of young men, I thought I could change this. I could do something different as a writer. That was my project. I didn't know I could become a writer. I didn't grow up thinking that I could become a writer. I had no models. If you grow up in Kuala Lumpur in the 1980s, there were really no models no professional models of novelists or any kind of writers. The only people who wrote were very, very rich people who could afford to write, and what they wrote was very terrible. It was not, as a lot of very bourgeois writing is. And so I set about writing a novel, and it was I didn't yet know that actually my obsession was with the stories, the way we deform and shape the narratives about ourselves in a country and in a region like Southeast Asia, a country like Malaysia and a region like Southeast Asia where life has changed so much, society has changed so much in the last 70 or 80 years, following the end of colonialism. The quest for a new identity has been so furious and so misguided that we have come up with stories of ourselves and our histories. So when you look at how countries like Malaysia and Singapore regard their recent histories, it's really, they apply the same logic and the same attitude that families apply to their own pasts, which is that basically anything that's uncomfortable, really very recently, we don't talk about that. We just pretend it's not. All the racial riots, all the kind of the political upheaval, we won't talk about that. And every country in Southeast Asia has been a victim of this. And I wanted to redress this balance and to somehow create some kind of space, start creating a space. I thought I could do it with one novel, and now I realize actually it's a lifetime's work, and it requires not just me, but it requires many other people to be doing this at the same time. But I wanted to create a space where people like me, like my family, like all the people I grew up with, could see themselves, could occupy the space in literature to be conserved for posterity, and in a way that somehow removes the West as the center of gravity, but is also truthful to the fact that we live in a very globalized world, and that the whole act of migration, of people moving from one continent to another, is essential to modern global identity. So that was what kept me going. But then also I was quite young. I was very young. I was only 25 when I was writing the first novel, and I think at that age, if I knew now what I know about publishing, I would have stopped. Which is not to say that anyone who's writing now, I really should encourage you to write. But I think if I had known how whole enterprise of writing is about luck, it's about accidents, it's about who you meet, it's about the situation you find yourself in. People always ask me, what advice would I give to young writers? And the only advice I would give, I went through a very negative period where I said the advice I would give is don't write. But now I'd say the essential thing is perseverance. You really just have to persevere. Because time will tell whether you're writing because you're just in love with the notion of writing, with the idea of being a writer, or whether or not there's something important that you want to say, that you feel that you have to say and only you can say that. Of course, it's a really, you have all these you have a lot of writers who think they have something to say and they don't have anything to say. You know, they tend to be older male writers, but that's something you won't know until you've given a lot of time to writing. So until I wrote a novel and it got published, I didn't know. And you know, along the way, you need a lot of luck, but luck only comes if you persevere.
All right, if there's one short question and you have one short answer,
Sorry.
we can continue. Yes.
Good evening, and thank you for the very informative talk. My question is very out of curiosity. Which village is it where you grew up?
Which village I grew up? It's a town. It's a small town. It's called. I mean, no one's ever heard of it. So.
I come from that region too. I would be very curious to know it.
Okay, it's called Parit.
Parit.
Parit, yes. Parit, Parit.
That's the region which got.
Sorry?
That region got quite flooded in the 70s and 80s.
It always gets flooded.
So I know that place.
No, it's not Paribunta for those people. Paribunta is big. This is small. This is like south of Pusing.
It's not Parit Bunta, it's Parit.
Yes, exactly. So, you know.
The school called Iskandar Shah is.
Yes, on the outskirts of the village, next to the cemetery.
I used to teach.
Oh, okay, well. Oh, wow, okay.
Now you go.
Okay, then you know my grandfather's shop is number 15, Jalan Besar.
But you mentioned that he is basically Hainan.
No, my father is Hainanese. They're Hokkien.
Okay, any other remittances from that town? Sure. Maybe wait for the microphone so we can...
I would have probably sold you a bar of soap if you were there.
Can you just tell us how do you derive your title of this book? Because it's very capturing.
As Mikhail sort of mentioned earlier, it was, you know, when I reimagined my maternal grandfather. Sorry? Yes, exactly. Arriving in Singapore from... no, they both arrived in Singapore. Both my grandfathers. I know that's the only fact I know for sure. They had nowhere to go, so they just unloaded off the boat, and they were on a pier, completely lost, and they only had the name of one person in their pocket, and that was it. So they were just strangers on the pier, and so this sense of bewilderment and loss and confusion, I think, is very striking. And also, you know, what is very striking to me, sorry, this is not going to be, it's just very quick,
Sure.
is that we have we have so many modern day equivalents of my grandfathers. You know, when you see the British press is full of people washed up on the beaches of Dover, and they have the same sense of like bewilderment. Where the hell am I? You know, they vaguely have a sense that they're in Britain, but apart from that, they're just washed up on the shore. And the confusion they must be going through is I think beyond articulation, which is why I think it's impossible to sort of speak to, going back into time to speak to my grandfather. So this is the attempt to do so.
Thank you so much, Tash Aw. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for coming. Thank you, Chantal. Thank you. I need to take one photograph.
So he will be answering more questions and signing books over there. And yes, thank you so much for coming to Zurich tonight.
Thank you so much on this very cold night.